welcome everybody to this webinar on EU enlargement, and good morning from Helsinki. Today our topic is enlargement, and we focus on the trio of Austria, Finland and Sweden, who joined the EU precisely 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, in 1995, all of these countries, Finland, Sweden and Austria, organized referendums that led finally to their EU accession. And today we find enlargement back as a major issue on the EU's agenda. Yet we know that now, as before, the preferences and priorities and concerns of member states regarding enlargement process differ. So in the event today, we ask three specialists how the three countries that accessed 30 years ago in 1995 now position themselves in the current enlargement debates, and how have their policies regarding enlargement evolved in recent years. Do these countries have some shared views regarding enlargement that could possibly underpin a broader EU consensus? Or is it the case that we are witnessing three separate national perspectives that underline the EU's lack of unity in enlargement issues? This event is organized in cooperation between the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, TEPSA, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, FIIA, and the Austrian Society for European Politics. Europa Club Vienna. Okay, let me now proceed to introduce our three speakers. We have from Sweden, Dr. Kalle Håkansson, who is a researcher at the Swedish Defense Research Agency's Division of Defense Analysis and Associate Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. From Finland, we have my colleague, Tyyne Karjalainen, who is a researcher in the European Union and Strategic Competition Program at FIIA. And from Austria, we have Paul Schmidt, who is the Secretary General at the Austrian Society of European Politics, and the editor of TEPSA's flagship book series called The Future of Europe, Views from the Capitals, which we will also address today. The latest edition, namely 2023 edition, focuses on the topic of enlargement, and it gathers together the views of more than 60 experts from 41 countries in the EU and its vicinity. And I will let Paul shortly to introduce the book more in depth. Today we will first hear input from all the three speakers, after which there will be a Q&A session, first with myself and the speakers, and after that we will open for the audience as well. By the way, I should introduce myself. I am Sanna Salo, a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. So you are also welcome to send questions before the Q&A with the audience in the chat box. Please do so, and we will address them in the end. But without further ado, let's now move on to hear input from the speakers. And let's start with Paul, who will also give you more detail about the book that I already mentioned. Please, Paul, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone from Vienna. It's great that we share this morning together and have I think, and what I expect, a very, very interesting exchange of views. Now, let me introduce the debate or kickstart the debate by quickly introducing this book, which is our most recent one, Enlargement and the Future of Europe, Views from the Capitals, which is, as Sanna has mentioned, published in the framework of TEPSA. And it is, in fact, the sixth book which we have done. It is a yearly exercise with almost all the members of TEPSA. TEPSA is a very decentralized network and has a decentralized structure with strong institutes in the member states, in the EU member states, but also beyond the EU member states, all over Europe. And that's why in this book you will find 41 chapters from 41 analysts covering 41 country perspectives on enlargement in the future of Europe. That's why we call it Views from the Capitals, in fact. And there's a foreword written by Oliver Röpke, who's the president of the European Economic and Social Committee. Now, this is the most recent one, and in fact, it is a sort of a travel guide that takes the reader through the European political landscape. You can pick and choose the country, and it is not an academic book, but academics are, of course, invited to read it as well. It's also, in particular, for practitioners and students and, well, lifelong learners, I would say. They're easy to read chapters. You pick and choose a country chapter, see what the enlargement views and perceptions are in the EU member states, in the candidate countries and beyond, from Iceland to Norway, from Turkey to many, many other countries. So it's a really interesting overview on the diversity, but also on the complexity, I would say, of the European Union and beyond the whole continent and the European countries. Now, I would also like to say that before saying something on Austria, maybe some of the key features of the book, which can be the basis for our discussion. But you still have to read the book anyway. Only because I give you some of my takeaways doesn't mean that you shouldn't take a look at it. So there's one feature actually, which I think doesn't come as a surprise, maybe, which is that the perception and the political approach to enlargement depends very much on geography, on the political, historical, economic development, on culture, and of course also on destiny, I would say. You can see, in fact, that of course the countries that are in the proximity and in the neighborhood of Southeastern Europe are very much focused on the Western Balkans. Countries in the Balkans, they show a lot of patience, but also enlargement fatigue, and to a certain extent, a high level of frustration, I would say, because they've been in the waiting room for more than two decades now, and many of them expect miracles from the European Union, which the European Union, I'm afraid, cannot deliver that way. And then there are, of course, countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, who have had on their own very positive experience with enlargement, and think that that is the reason why they need to have a positive attitude towards future enlargement rounds. But for example, the case of Spain shows that there's not yet enough analysis on the impact and, in particular, the financial and political consequences of enlargement. The whole MFF will completely change. The political center of gravity will move. So there's a lot of dynamic development in here, which is not yet tangible, I would say, for some of the countries. And then, of course, you have northern countries, Baltics, Poland, who are very much focused on Ukraine, while I would say, I mean, we have Kale here and Tine, of course, they have they're here to give their own story, but our perception is, and what we can read from the book, that the security dimension is really, really important. But if you dig deeper, there's also a mixed picture. I mean, who do you ask in those countries? Depending on what group and what sector you talk to, there are different perceptions and opinions. If you talk to Polish agriculture, the situation might be a very different one than when you talk to the political level. Now, the book and TEPSA on its whole, in fact, could be seen as an institutional think tank policy institute blueprint for Macron's European political community, maybe a sort of inspiration, but that's, I think, what the book is all about. It gives you a big picture, not only on what the EU27 think, but way beyond. I think that's important. And I would like to just stress to conclude some of my own takeaways from the book. Now, of course, if you look at the chapters, there are things and patterns and features that all or many of the countries have in common, and then there are differences. One thing that they have in common is that enlargement has been a success story of transformation. And this transformation takes time. Some countries are quicker than others. And this positive narrative on enlargement might not be perceived in the same way depending on which country you ask or where you lead the debate. But of course, there's also mentioning of the costs of non-enlargement. What would have been the costs if we wouldn't have enlarged? And I think that's something that one has really to look at in order to make a stronger case. Second takeaway, enlargement has been and is a geopolitical instrument. It is a political decision at the end of the day, but it is much more than that. And there is tension between the geopolitical argument and the security argument on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, the social and economic dimension, and also the institutional and political dimension of enlargement. Third takeaway, enlargement is not about altruism, but about resilience, I would say. And then we come again to the geopolitical dimension of enlargement. Fourth, and I mentioned that before, enlargement takes time. For many candidates, it can be a frustrating process, and there's a lot of enlargement fatigue on both sides of the negotiating table, I would say. And there's a mismatch between expectations on what the European Union can actually deliver on and what it cannot do. Miracles, I'm afraid, don't exist. But the goal always is to export stability and not to import instability, I would say. Now, my next takeaway is that, of course, enlargement is also an external trigger for reforming the European Union. Are we fit? Are we ready for enlargement? I would say no, but that's the process in which we're in right now. And let's see how far we get here, institutionally, politically, but also when it comes to public perception. And I think the new Commissioner for Enlargement made it quite clear that there's a much needed debate on enlargement in the member states as well. And just look at what is just happening in France. And remember that in the French case, there would be a need for a referendum. And also, if you look at the Austrian case, for example, many of our governments have been in favor and actually supporting the Western Balkan countries on their path towards accession. But there's a 2/3 majority of the people which is not really in favor. And why is that? Because if you keep criticizing the European Union in domestic politics, and then you say, but now we have to enlarge, there might be a mismatch here, I would say. So we have to make the case also in our countries. I think that's important. And if you look at the Eurobarometer, for example, there is a small majority in favor of enlargement now. Everything has changed. The whole picture has, of course, changed after the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But it is not a priority of the people, of the Europeans. We have to keep that in mind. And also that we have not really been thinking about alternatives to enlargement. You might say we are past that point, but I think that's something that where we should have had different options on where to go, and we haven't done so. My next takeaway is, of course, on gradual integration. That's also something that you can read about in the different chapters. Is this the way to go? It probably is. Up to discussion, front-loading benefits to make sure that people have tangible and positive results, because the process just takes time. Now, To conclude the introduction, I want to just mention two chapters, the one on Montenegro, I think Montenegro being the front runner for a new round of enlargement, and the one on Bosnia. Montenegro, with the population very much in favor of EU accession, but still I've mentioned that before, there's a sense of urgency and a sense of lack of dynamism, I would say. But Montenegrinians, as well as Bosnians, they have not lost a sense of humor. I think that's really important in that process. And people in Montenegro would argue, for us, Montenegro, you don't have to reform the European Union because we can easily fill the gap that the UK left behind. I think, which is kind of funny, with Montenegro having 600,000 people living there and the UK being a little bigger, but they're probably right. And then the Bosnian humor, which you will find in the chapter, is the question that is raised by the author: what is the difference between a Bosnian optimist and a Bosnian pessimist? And the Bosnian optimist is a Bosnian that thinks that Turkey will join the European Union during the Bosnian EU Council presidency, while the pessimist would argue that Bosnia would join the European Union during the Turkish EU Council presidency. So at least people have not lost their sense of humor, and I think that's crucial. But I think, to conclude, the book helps to better understand the complexity, the diversity, and the dynamic behind this whole process, and the geopolitical urgency and the security dimension, which is important, but not all of it. With that, I would stop, but I look very much forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this insightful input. Let's then move on to Kalle Håkansson. Please, Kalle, the floor is yours for your input.
Thank you, and good morning all, and great to be with you this morning to give a Swedish overview of EU enlargement. We can see that Sweden, since it joined the EU, has firmly been in the kind of pro-enlargement camp of the Union. It was a strong supporter of the Big Bang enlargement in the early 2000s. It was, together with Poland, one of the architects behind the Eastern Partnership and trying to kind of integrate these partners closer to the Union. With that said, I think that in the 2010s up till the 2020s, Sweden, in line with the kind of overall mood of the Union, took a kind of lesser ambitious approach to enlargement. And during this time, there was very little kind of a momentum for a larger European Union. And we had this clear enlargement fatigue in the whole Union. And this kind of clearly affected the Swedish stance as well. However, as you all know, the kind of Russian war on Ukraine changed everything. We once again saw this momentum for enlargement. And this is rightly so, due to the kind of geopolitical pressure. And enlargement is one of the biggest geopolitical tools that the Union has. But with that said, I think that the Swedish government and the Swedish kind of political scene is often kind of emphasizing that this is a balancing act as well. It's a very geopolitical tool, it's a political tool, but the process should also be based on merits. It should, the Union should not kind of overpromise and under-deliver to all of the countries that wants to be part of the Union. And we saw that when Sweden held the EU presidency last year, it had the kind of support to Ukraine and also support to other partner countries in focus, that the Union needs to really support these countries in reforms and try to kind of speed up the accession process to the EU. But it also, then the government underlined that the Union needs to kind of start to think about and start to discuss the workings of the Union in terms of enlargement. They kind of underline questions like, how will enlargement affect EU's different policies? How will it affect the EU budget? How will it affect the workings of the EU institutions? This is important questions that I think that we need to have more pressing political discussions today to really make the union fit for 30 or 35 countries going ahead. But coming back to the Swedish case, we can see that the kind of political scene in Sweden is overall very supportive of enlargement. Almost all parties in parliament is very supportive of this, and this has really been strengthening by Russia's war in Ukraine. And the current government has really expressed that it is no longer a question if, but when and how the EU will expand. And they kind of underline that the EU is spreading stability, democracy, and the respect of rule of law through enlargement. And this is something really important for Sweden. But as I said, they really underlined that it should be based on merit. Then it needs to be progress in domestic reforms in candidate countries. The EU has requirements that needs to be met. For instance, the rule of law really needs to be met, and we have seen this with both current and old or new members. So this is something that needs to be thought through. They've also kind of underlined that when we will see enlargement, we probably need to look into the policies such as agriculture and cohesion policy, the EU's budget and decision making probably need to be reviewed. And this is something that I think that we need to have this more pressing discussion at the moment for that. The current government and the political community in Sweden, I would say, is also started to kind of express that they are supporting the kind of gradual integration of candidate countries to the union. However, this is something that they underline, that this is a process that should make the countries ready for EU membership. It should be an incentive for kind of further reforms, and it should not be seen as a kind of replacement for membership. Instead, it should be seen as the path towards membership. And this is something really important for the Swedish case. However, the current government also argued that we don't need treaty change for making the union fit for enlargement. They argued that the current treaty is enlargement proof already. They underscore, for instance, that it's already possible to move towards qualified majority voting, for instance, in certain policy areas, and the government has opted for opening or for making QMV, for instance, the common foreign and security policy in terms of sanctions, in terms of human rights issues, civilian missions, and so on. However, there's underlined that they don't want QMV in, for instance, tax policy from the Swedish government side. From my perspective, I would argue that we need to really start to think about reform, and I think that we maybe need to start to think about treaty changes. This is something not the Swedish political community would like, but I think this is needed. But to kind of conclude with my intro remarks, I think we can see that the public also in Sweden really has increased support for enlargement again. And this is clearly connected to Russia's war on Ukraine. This seems to be stable at the moment, but there of course could be changes if the overall mood in Europe would change. And in that regard, I think that we have big tasks coming ahead with even more war fatigue in Europe, with uncertainties about the US policies during the new President Trump and how that will affect Europe. And here, Sweden, alongside, I would say, the Nordic, Baltics, some Central Europeans like Poland, sits in the camp that really supports Ukraine. But with that said, I think we have a lot of uncertainties in terms of the war and the enlargement process. How could we integrate a country at war? What would that mean for the union? I'm clearly in the camp that we need to integrate Ukraine, but I also think that we need to think about these big questions going ahead. And also it's important that the EU doesn't kind of overpromise to all of the countries that are candidates to the Union. But with that, I conclude, and I look forward to the further discussions.
Thank you also, Kalle. Tune, please. It's your turn for the input from the Finnish perspective.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm speaking here in individual capacity as a researcher, but I will make a few observations from the book chapter that was written by my colleague Juha Jokela to this book that was mentioned here today. And so I will highlight 4 points in what I think are really important to understand in the Finnish positions on EU enlargement. Firstly, a generally positive stance. Then, on the other hand, bit divided attitudes amongst the Finnish citizens. Then, thirdly, Finland has focused on the merit-based approach. This is the core in the Finnish policy. And then, fourthly, it is fair to say that Finland is not or has not been among the most active member states in promoting or reforming EU enlargement policies. And I'll come back to these all. But to start with the generally positive attitude, I have been studying the election campaigns in the European Parliament elections in the summer and in many member states, and it is clear that enlargement continues to be a very divisive topic in several member states, especially in France, where more parties actually oppose enlargement than are in favor of it. This is good to know as a context, because in this context where enlargement is divisive in the European context, in Finland it is not really divisive topic for the political parties, but actually all Finnish parties are in favor of EU enlargement now in the current situation. And as actually Juha's chapter shows in this book, this is a long-term trend in Finland. So the political elite has been rather unanimous and all parties in favor of enlargement for a long time. Before the Big Bang enlargement in early 2000s, only the Finns party, which was rather minor back then, was against, but all other parties were in favor already back then. So how to explain this? What have been the key justifications for Finns to be in favor of enlargement? If we go back in history again to the early 2000s, before the Big Bang enlargement, we see that one key justification, or the most important one, was definitely that enlargement was considered to bring peace and stability to Europe, to unify the continent that was somehow divided after the Cold War. Secondly, there is this kind of economic narrative where enlargement is perceived to bring just more prosperity to the European continent. Then if we compare this narrative to today, how political parties in Finland now justify enlargement, the peace and stability narrative is still there. Now there is a bit more emphasis also on promoting democracy through enlargement. And then there are, of course, the geopolitical reasons that are now highlighted when the enlargement has been kind of rebooted in the wartime context. And as actually quite typical at the European level, the center-right parties also in Finland emphasize these geopolitical reasons very often. So increasing the influence of the European Union at the global level by enlarging, while center-left parties are more focused on these peace and democracy justifications. Okay, but then the second point that I made was this divided attitudes among Finns. And as Juha mentions in his chapter, Finland has had these pro-enlargement governments, but skeptic citizens. And actually, when I looked to Eurobarometer data from early 2000, it is clear that Finns were actually amongst the most divided in Europe in terms of attitudes, and especially Finns from the rural areas were opposed to enlargement. This is explained by many concerns. It is also clear by this Eurobarometer data that Finns had a bit more concerns about enlargement than many other Europeans. So about increasing disunity in the Union, about decision-making coming more difficult, about Finland's influence decreasing, and also the costs were, of course, discussed. then if you look to the discussion today, of course these same concerns are again on the table. So I think it's quite interesting to go back to this discourse, because not so much has actually changed, while some other concerns have then emerged. So for instance, now of course rule of law is highlighted by all Finnish parties basically, or most Finnish parties in terms of EU enlargement. The attitudes amongst the citizens have become more positive about enlargement now, especially during the full-scale war in Ukraine. So there definitely is this kind of shift also in Finland, and actually Finns are amongst the or more supportive in terms of Ukraine's membership, for instance, than average EU citizens. Then the third point that I wanted to make was about the merit-based approach, which I think is really in the core of the Finnish enlargement policy. And I think it actually means three things, the merit-based approach for Finland. So it means that Finland is actually genuinely concerned about democratic backsliding and the corruption of rule of law in the European Union, and that's why it emphasizes merits for the candidates. Then it also means, this merit-based approach, that Finland is against politicizing the enlargement process. So it is against this kind of political vetoes and would not like to see them. Then thirdly, Finland does not really have any, or has not had any preferences in terms of the candidates, like geographic preferences, as much as some other member states. So Finland has promoted the same standards, same merit-based approach for all candidates. Now we saw some compromises or flexibility to these norms during the war. So Finland was flexible with merits. Actually, when in 2022, when Ukraine's candidate status was on the table, I learned that there were some concerns that Finland would oppose giving Ukraine the candidate status, because Finland has had this very strong focus on merits. But then this was not, of course, the case, because also Finland sees this in the very geopolitical context now, and then was flexible with the merits and in favor of granting Ukraine the candidate status. And then Finland has also now, or some parties in Finland have also started to emphasize or focus on some candidates, for instance, the Finnish party and also the National Coalition. If you look to their policy programs, they consider Ukraine's membership a bit more urgent maybe than the membership of some other candidates. So these are some new developments. But then the fourth point that I had was about that Finland has not been particularly proactive in enlargement policies, or not among the member states that would have been pushing for enlargement or making initiatives or advocating for the membership of some candidates specifically. Juha also notes in his chapter that Finland has shied away from discussing necessary EU reforms, maybe so, and he proposes that Finland should really focus on EU reforms now. And I definitely do agree, and I think that if Finland is a country in favor of enlargement, it is really important to acknowledge that during the past decade, the enlargement policy has not created enlargement, right? So if we want enlargement, then we need to reform the enlargement policies and process, and we need to develop our approach to enlargement. The current policies are not really leading to enlargement. At least they have not been very effective. So I would have three kind of concluding points where I think Finland should focus if it is a pro-enlargement country. So and what I think would be feasible or somehow make sense in this context of earlier Finnish policies. Firstly, to address the political vetoes that have been the key obstacle in the process. And this could mean, for instance, decreasing the number of times when member states unanimously take a decision during the accession process. So because now the situation is that the member states need to agree quite many times before one state can actually access the union. So maybe the number of times when a unanimous decision is needed could be decreased. Then the second point that I was thinking about was this merit-based approach, how it could be strengthened. Because we know, based on research, that the clearer the process is, the more credible the kind of the membership carrot is, the incentive is, the more effective the transformative power of the union will be, and the more effective the candidates will likely be in their reforms. So this is really something to focus on, to make the process even more clear, to strengthen them, or have better rewards and maybe punishments also if we see backsliding. And this could be then this gradual approach that has been discussed. So rewarding candidates for their progress with some accession to some EU policies, for instance, such as the single market, which is a big thing, of course, and needs to be discussed how to do it. Then the final point, I think, if we want to prevent backsliding, if it is the key fear that we have, then we really should focus on making the enlargement or the accession process in the candidate states as inclusive as possible. So we should make sure that we do not only engage with the elites in the candidate states, but really have whole of the society approach and keep all the political parties as well, involved in the EU accession process, and not only political parties, but really the civil society that is in the most crucial role, making sure that we don't see backsliding in the future, because they have this kind of domestic checks and balances. So I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. We have a lot to chew on. Does any of the speakers want to come in directly and comment? Yes, Paul, at least on the others' inputs, and then I have a few questions for you. Yes, please, Paul.
I wanted to say I very much agree with the final points of Tine. I think they're very important. Address vetoes, clear process. I think more sticks and carrots, and a strong engagement with the civil society. I think they're key, because in many of the countries we are negotiating with a political elite which is not known for their democratic traditions. So, but the question is, how can we change our approach to enlargement to make it work even better? And I think there are two dimensions. There's the internal dimension, which I think also Kalle mentioned. How do we prepare ourselves? I see that there are differences between Sweden, Finland, and Austria in that respect. Austria is very much the Austrian governments are very much in favor of bringing in the Western Balkans. So there's a clear geographic preference on the one. That's one point. Second point is, while we seem to be very much in favor of enlargement, there's not enough thinking and talk and priorities set regarding the internal dimension, the reform dimension. Now, another difference is that the security dimension, which seemed to be very obvious in Sweden and Finland, is not at all obvious in Austrian politics and with the Austrian public. I think there are two differences. And what we have in common is, of course, that we have a very positive perception of the history of EU enlargement. But Tina mentioned the divisiveness of the population. Today, the situation is different because there's a geopolitical dimension which is much more urgent. But there's a very clear picture in Austria which needs to be confronted, that 2/3 of the population would like to see a consolidation and a better functioning of the European Union before we enlarge, while and that's why I come to the external dimension, if the European Union really wants to be a geopolitical actor, it has to deliver. And it has to deliver now, because this is the time when we are in a very, very critical situation. But of course, the domestic internal dimension and the external dimension are very much linked, because you need the political will and the political strength to deliver. Who are the ones that can actually politically help boosting the people that stand up for democracy in the Western Balkans, in Ukraine, in Moldavia, or in Georgia? Are they really sitting in the institutions in Brussels? I mean, there is strong leadership from Ursula von der Leyen, and also now from Antonio Costa and Kaja Kallas. But the member states have to do much more there. They cannot contradict what they decide together on a European level, and they have to be much more active to help those countries and to stand up for the rule of law and for democracy. And I think that's where I see a gap, a delivery gap, because if member states are not active, how can we actually support a civil society in those countries? Being afraid of the domestic political dimension where nationalists becomes ever more stronger is probably not a good recipe.
Okay, it seems to me that there are two dimensions in the debate now. There's as Paul said, the internal reform dimension, and then there's the question of enlargement policies. Yes, Tune, please come in.
Yeah, I cannot not comment because these dimensions are my favorite topic. So but I would argue that there are actually three dimensions, which really are interdependent. So there is the dimension of geopolitics, right? That's the dimension why we are now talking about enlargement also in this webinar, right? That's what made enlargement topical again. Then there is the dimension of state building in the candidate country, so transition or reforms, however you want to call it. And then there is the third dimension, which is the EU reform. And I think it is really important to think about these all three dimensions, because if we fail with the security policies, then we most likely will not manage to support transitions in the candidate states. And then we maybe don't see EU reform if there is no push for it. If we fail with the state building in the candidate states, so fail to support transitions, I think Paul had a great point there. We really need to support those transitions. It's really important that member states are active there. Then, of course, we fail also with our geopolitical objective. It is now a geopolitical objective for the EU to enlarge, and it will not happen if the candidates fail with their reforms. And at the same time, of course, it will not happen if we fail with the EU reform. And again, if we fail with the EU reform, then the transitions in the candidate states will not help them to join the union, because they will not join as long as the main member states hold that the EU needs to be reformed before they can join the union. So it's really like there are so many dependencies between these dimensions. This was just something I wanted to mention.
Yes. So a lot of you touched upon both of these dimensions that I mentioned, the enlargement policy dimension and the internal reform dimension in your input. But in order to sort of recap and be a bit systematic about it, I wondered if all of you could briefly state or restate what do you think that are the most important internal reforms that the EU should engage in order to be able to enlarge? And can the EU enlarge in the first place without internal reform? So is widening possible without some sort of deepening? There is then the other dimension of the enlargement policy. Dune, for example, said a lot about that, how you think, or from the Finnish perspective, what should be done about it. If I remember correctly, Kalle, for example, didn't say that much. So you can also touch upon that. But I would like your opinion on the internal reforms that are required, if any, or how to proceed in these two. Let's start with Kalle, for example, to give you the floor.
Yeah, of course. I think, as I said, the current government would say that we don't need to reform the union to be able to expand the union and to enlarge the union. I would say that we probably need. We need to think about our decision-making processes. We have a lot of vetoes. We have seen today with spoilers in the political process. I think that this is something that needs to be addressed if we will be 30, 35 countries in the coming decade, for instance, in the Union. So I think that this is probably one of the most important issues to address. I also think that we need to start to think about the budget. How is the cohesion policy working, agriculture? How does we make the Union kind of fit for a new reality in terms of for instance, the Draghi report in competitiveness and defense issues and so on. And I think that this is something that we need to start to do now, and not when countries are joining or close to joining, since then we have this big kind of stressful process. And I think that this is something that will take time. It will be difficult. it will be very political sensitive, but it's something that is needed for the union to fit more countries in.
Paul?
I agree. We need a reform on institutions and on the budget. And I also agree that we don't need a treaty change for that. What we would need is actually a political will and political strength. We can move to QMV without treaty change. We can take a final decision on own resources and a different structure of the EU budget and our spending structure without treaty change. It's just a question of political will, which is not there at the moment. Geopolitical thinkers would argue that we have to advance with enlargement, and reform comes at a later stage. At the end of the day, I think there will be no enlargement without reform. But maybe it's true that you need to feel the pressure of change before something changes. Everyone is for change, but if you have to change and you have to bring the argument to your people, it becomes more difficult. So maybe we have to prepare well and take the relevant decision at a later stage. But I mean, there's so many vested interests, but it's time to change the whole structure and put it upside down. Otherwise, if we enlarge without reform, there's always the risk and the danger of implosion, of course.
Tune.
Yes, well, yeah, you are absolutely right. So of course the key issue I think that needs to be underlined is that main German centrist parties think that the EU needs to be reformed before it enlarges. This is also the requirement of many French parties. In the European Parliament, of the most centrist European Parliament groupings. So the biggest member states basically require that the EU needs to be reformed before enlargement. And at the same time, you have member states in Central Eastern Europe that are totally opposed to it. So this is the key challenge, right? So this is really an issue that we need to address really quickly so that this does not prevent the whole enlargement. And what does the reform then mean? It will include, as mentioned, most likely we will discuss about having more qualified majority voting in certain policy areas, because there is the fear that decision making will become even more difficult after taking more members. Then there are many other questions as well. For instance, the cohesion funds, agriculture reform, which is a huge thing for member states like Ukraine joining with huge agricultural sectors. Of course, this is also not a new issue. If you look into what were the debates 20 years ago, it's exactly the same topic. So this is not something totally new for the European Union. Agricultural policies need to be reformed sometimes. So this is something to look into. And then, of course, like questions such as the number of commissioners and members in the European Parliament and this kind of things.
Thank you.
Tana, can I just jump in for a moment?
Yes, please.
Maybe at the end of the day, I mean, MFF budget discussions are very, very difficult. We know that. And we have a very new and urgent security dimension, which needs much more money than we can actually ever find in the EU budget. So the way to go would probably be to leave the MFF more or less as it is and add something to it, add a new financial layer to it. That might help in the discussion. But it's all a question of timing, in fact. We need this boost in security right now. So this is in the negotiations and with the institutional changes, these different priority settings from member state to member state might even help to reach a big package deal.
Yeah. There are already some questions in the chat, and I am keen to give the audience also further possibilities to ask questions. Let me just ask maybe one or two more questions. First, I would like your idea or your views on the idea of this kind of differentiated enlargement or this staged accession process where countries could access selected policies before becoming full EU members. This has been promote it as a way of making the enlargement policy somehow deliver a bit better. Do you have any views on the viability of this strategy? Maybe we now start with Tune.
Yeah, sure. So the background is, of course, that we do realize that the enlargement policy, as it has been, has not been successful in keeping the candidates also on board, because the process has been so long that the candidates have lost hope, and the kind of the incentive does not work anymore, because the candidates are afraid that they do these very costly reforms and are not rewarded in the end, because we see with North Macedonia or Albania, for instance, how the process has been. So this is the kind of the background for the gradual accession, that we need rewards already during the process in order to keep the candidates on board. And also to show to the citizens in the candidate countries that the accession process actually pays off. There are some benefits from it. Now, however, the challenge is then, the reality is that we are already moving towards that direction. Like the revised methodology is already a step towards a more gradual approach. And we are now talking about could we make it more gradual. So, for instance, take some candidate states when it has met all the necessary criteria, whether it could access the single market, for instance, first, and security and defense policy much later when it has, because that's maybe the most sensitive area of EU policies. So this is one thing that is being discussed. But there are, of course, other ideas as well. But how this is perceived in the candidate states, it's just good to mention that this is not good news for them necessarily. Or many candidate states have been afraid that this idea of gradual accession would actually mean just more delays. So the experience in the Western Balkans is right that, for instance, the revision of the enlargement methodology meant that the process was delayed. And Ukraine is also afraid that this just means that the real accession then is postponed even more, or that they get only some kind of B class membership. But maybe I'll stop here, so if others want to comment as well.
Thank you. Kalle?
Yeah, I completely agree with Tina, and I think that the gradual process could be really good in terms of being a carrot for candidate countries to do reforms, to be connected to the single market or certain policy areas of the union, and in that sense, seeing this momentum towards membership. However, there are this risk that some countries, especially if we look ahead, will use the kind of gradual process of kind of delaying the process for candidate countries. We are seeing the kind of geopolitical push for enlargement at the moment, but let's see in a couple of years what will happen then. Then this could actually drag the process even kind of longer. So this is a risky tool, but I think it's also in a way to really show that we are moving towards membership, but there are risks, as I said.
Okay, Paul.
Well, I would just mention 3 examples. I think it's a good idea. I remember last year visiting Montenegro, Podgorica. I was there for 24 hours, and I had a telephone bill of 200 euros, which I had not seen in the last 3 years on my bank account. So why not include them in the free roaming area with the EU? I think that's something that would also be welcomed by its citizens. And of course, when it comes to trans-European traffic networks and communication, I mean, that's something where you have to think cross-border and, of course, include all the countries as quickly as possible. That connects with, of course, the climate issue, or take, on a political level, take the issue of granting them observatory status. That's, in fact, something that the European Committee on Social and Economic Affairs has already done. And I think it's a good way to bring in civil society on that level, but also politics, to make sure that you pressure them to fulfill not only adopt the acquis, but actually implement everything on a sustainable basis. These are just some examples. There are many others that I could mention. But I think what is important is to make it tangible for the people.
Thank you. Then Tune wanted to go in and then come in, and then I would like to open up for the audience as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, of course, the idea with you actually asked about differentiation. So the idea is, of course, not only to make the accession gradual, but also to allow for the existing member states to deepen integration at the same time, so that we don't need to wait for the enlargement and then deepen integration, but actually we can. Some member states can already move forward, for instance, in defense cooperation or economic integration or these kind of affairs. So to allow both to protect the most sensitive kind of circles or topics of EU policies while enlarging, and also to allow like deepening at the same time.
Yes, thank you. Now we are a lot of participants, but I think if you want to come in, you could open up your camera and raise your hand so we see that. But we could now begin with the questions we already have in the chat. I could, for example, read the first one out loud, and then whoever of you wants to comment can make it known. So let's first have Andreas Erdina's question. I worked at the European Commission, DG Enlarge, during the Big Bang 2004 enlargement. At the time, the Commission services, Council services were well staffed, and the EU MS very committed to making enlargement succeed. Do you see sufficient resources being available to manage future enlargements, Ukraine and others? Who would like to comment? Paul, please.
I think Andreas, thank you for the question. I think he knows the answer much better than at least I do, because he's been there for a very long time with a lot of experience. And probably the answer is no. There are not enough resources. We've mentioned before in the discussion that the European Commission, European institutions want to transform themselves into geopolitical actors. And that also implies that the accession process has to gain in speed and has to be much more political at the end of the day, not taking away the merit-based approach. And member states have to get much more involved. So we need more resources. We need more financial resources. We need more human resources, more experts in the field. We need to support the country politically. I mean, we have thousands of people going on the street now in Georgia. And where is the European Union and the European member states apart from press releases? I mean, we probably have to be on the street there with them, or have what do EU capitals say? I mean, I think there's not enough going on, and we seem to react all the time. We need much more contingency planning, and that implies that we need more resources, definitely.
Would Tune or Kalle like to comment? You don't have anything to add. I will then read the second question. Elene Gadnice. I cannot pronounce all these names. It's wonderful that we have such a diverse crowd here. Sorry about that. You say that enlargement is not possible at the moment, but consider Georgia, where people are actively fighting against their government to protect the values that the EU represents. Can they be ignored? For how long? While a transformation process is inevitable, what can the EU offer when the will of the people is so strong? Beyond simply criticizing the government for its actions, what tangible support can the EU provide to show solidarity with those striving for European values? Tune, please.
Yeah, maybe I can just, I'm not really an expert on internal dynamics in Georgia, but I can just say that the challenge for the European Union is, of course, that it is not forcing any candidate to join. So if a candidate state turns its foreign policy and is not pursuing EU membership anymore, the EU is not going to intervene in a way. So enlargement of the European Union is not an interventionist policy in that sense, that we would push for states to pursue the membership. Then, of course, in Georgia, I know the situation that challenge is that the citizens and the government are not on the same page, and then the question is how the EU can actually support the citizens and civil society. And there again, the problem is that if EU funds, for instance, some civil society organizations, their position might not be improved actually, but be worsened in the domestic context. So I maybe don't have so much solutions, but I could only mention some problems that there are in the support. But I don't know if Kalle has some good initiatives.
Maybe not, but I think that want to pick up something that Paul said, that I think that we really need to see the capitals engaged. This doesn't it isn't just the EU that needs to be engaged, the EU leadership, the EU officials. It's the capitals. We need knowledge in the capitals about the candidate countries, about the process, how we can support them, how we should support them. So this should be both Brussels-based, but also in the capitals around Europe, and especially in the countries that really are pro-enlargement.
Does Paul want to comment on this question further? No.
Sanna, you are muted.
I'm so sorry. The next question is from Dirk Temmerman, and it's related to a question that I actually also wanted to ask about the public opinion in the EU countries. The question is as follows. How can the enlargement benefit the daily lives of the households in the Western European countries, for example, Belgium, knowing that there is a cultural wide gap with those candidates? So I also picked up in the previous, in your input in the conversation we had, that in some countries, Austria was mentioned, the gap between elite and public opinion is actually quite large. Finland also was mentioned. And it's also possible that in some countries where this momentum of the Ukraine war has now raised awareness of enlargement and made the public opinion more favorable, that the tide will turn again. So how can we address this? What can we do about bringing the elite opinion and public opinion more to the same level, so that the enlargement process would have backing in the EU countries as well? Maybe all of you could give your short views on this topic. Do you want to go first?
Yes, maybe. I don't have a marketing speech for the enlargement prepared for an average citizen in any Western European country, but maybe I think it's just important to increase awareness of the typical narratives, because I think it is important to understand, or it would be good to communicate and remind or increase awareness among citizens that every time the EU has enlarged, the media has really been very vocal about the cultural differences, about the fear, about the migration risks, about the risk of crime and corruption, and highlighting how these post-communist countries, for instance, are joining the Union. So just to understand that this is not a new idea that comes to your mind, but this is something that the media has been kind of like, also this image of the threat that an academician would maybe call this kind of othering, or just like emphasizing the differences between the Western European countries and Eastern European countries is really something that the media has been busy doing. So if this kind of idea comes to your mind, it might not be your own idea, but it is really something that we have been hearing a lot in the media. So just maybe it's a good thing to remember that maybe the fears that we had already before the Big Bang enlargement, for instance, about the Polish plumber. This was one of the images created by the media, right? How the Polish workers come and then no one has works anymore or jobs anymore in the Western European countries. These fears were not realized, right? They did not materialize, but these kind of threats were really actively communicated and debated in the media. I looked into the Finnish media debate in early 2000s, and the journalists were really creative, for instance, describing the potential decision-making in the EU after enlargement. It was really funny how they were describing, like, there were these kind of sentences like, just imagine the 25 interior ministers coming to the room and everyone speaks for 5 minutes about what they're going to speak and then only start, so the meetings will take 4 hours. And these kind of like catastrophe scenarios were really, really widely spread in the media. So this is just maybe some context to know.
Media has a lot of responsibility. What is, Paul, your view from the Austrian perspective, given that there is?
Well, thank you, Dirk, for your question. I think that's the €1 million question that capitalists have to solve. And this question would probably deserve more than one session to get into detail. Is there really a cultural gap, I would say, and I would side with Tine on this. The 10% of the Austrian population has roots in Southeastern Europe already. Actually, the western part of Ukraine is closer to Vienna than the most western part of Austria. So it's about raising awareness, because if you would ask the people on the street, if you would be able to take a plane and go to Ukraine, how long would this take you compared to going to Western Europe? And my guess would be that the answer would be 5 hours or something like that. But Ukraine is much closer than we think. So I think we have to get out there and explain that there's no such thing as a cultural gap. What there is of course a economic welfare gap between the countries. If you look at the 10 candidate countries now, they're of course not the richest ones, but the poorest ones, economically speaking. And then you can draw from the experience of the last rounds of enlargement, where in particular countries like Austria benefited economically very much from enlargement. But then you could also argue, well, get them into the European economic area, get them closer to the single market, only because of the economic argument. Why do they have to join? Or who benefits from this enlargement economically? Is it the average people on the street, or is it who is it? So there's a lot of need for discussion, I think, also when it comes to the security dimension and political dimension of enlargement and democratic dimension of enlargement. I think there's not this sense of urgency. And I would not blame anyone in the public, because, I mean, again, the Austrian case, if you were confronted with a political discourse that keeps telling you what are the things that do not work and do not function on a European level, and then you tell them, but hey, I think we should enlarge better sooner than later, it does not work. So you have to be, I mean, it's good to criticize, but when things are going the right way, well, then you also should be willing to say that and make the case. I think I see national politics many times shying away from making the argument for these kind of future developments and the need to do that, and I think that is something that has to change.
Kalle, do you want to comment on this question?
Yeah, and I think that to make enlargement work, we really need to sell it to our population all around Europe. And I think that today we have this very geopolitical view on enlargement, mainly due to the war. But this is something that maybe will change in the future. We also see different areas of Europe will have different views on this going forward. So kind of this geopolitical view isn't kind of the only argument that we can use to say that we need to enlarge the union. And I think we really need to sell the economic issue as well. Look, for instance, at the Baltic states, when they joined the EU, they have really contributed in an economic way to the union to improve economics in the whole Europe. So I think that this is something that we need to kind of put in the spotlight for everyday citizen, and also show that this is a way to make Europe continue to grow and have economic development. So this is something that I hope could kind of get resonance around kind of everyday citizen in a way.
Very interesting. If I had more time, I would have actually asked you about these competing narratives on the benefits and pitfalls of enlargement. But we have 5 minutes time, and there are two questions from the audience. I will read both of the questions, and you can pick which one you want to comment on. So then both have a chance of being answered. So first one is from Ville Saboranta. Question on the when of enlargement, as the current enlargement cycle is clearly more security driven And for example, several of the candidates have ongoing CSDP missions and operations, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina. What level of agreement is there between member states on the timing of accession in these countries? Will the stability in these countries need to be settled first, or will the member states accept new members currently in conflict or major internal divisions? This was one question. Then there's one from an anonymous attendee. Speaking of the necessity to reform the enlargement policy, it is clear that states from the Western Balkans are particularly vulnerable when it comes to vetoes from other states in the region, North Macedonia with Bulgaria/Greece, Croatia with Slovenia, etc. Hence, how would you say the EU should approach this phenomenon? So two rather long questions. I think you can see them in the chat if you need to be reminded. So just please, you can comment on whichever question you think you have something to say about.
Okay, I just start.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. I would give two brief answers to both.
Yes, very brief. Since we have 3 minutes, very brief.
Very brief. I believe that there's not a very high level of agreement between the member states regarding the timing of accession at this point in time. I very much hope that stability goes first, but then you never know where geopolitics will lead us. And on the second question on the veto, if you look at the history of European integration, it has been full of national vetoes, and it's always there has been always a way to lift them. It's just a matter of dialogue and solving those problems. But ask the EU member states, and they can give you all can tell you all very big and interesting stories when they were confronted with vetoes or they used the veto card themselves. So I don't think that's an issue that will block us from moving forward.
Thank you so much, Paul. Would Tune or Kalle like to comment on these final questions?
I can just quickly say that it is maybe good to know that Russia is using these frozen conflicts in several of the candidate states as a way to prevent their European integration, right? And this is a reason why the European Union has not clearly stated, for instance, that the war needs to be over or Transnistria needs to be resolved before these countries can join the Union. And I think it is a wise policy in a way that we are a bit flexible. But of course, you cannot join the Union if you don't control your borders. So there needs to be some kind of solution, right? Well, the second question was about the vetoes. Maybe just one thing to note is that maybe it is good to acknowledge that in the past, the Bulgarian and Greece vetoes have been also accepted by other member states and even encouraged in some cases. And this is maybe something we can also address, that it's not only some countries sometimes blocking the process, but then we can also put the blame on those member states that do not actively oppose these vetoes, right? Or are even happy that there is a veto because they are also against enlargement. So just to bring these dimensions in.
Thank you. And Kalle, you have the final word.
Just very shortly, I can say that I can echo Tina's comment about the security situation. And I think that this is a kind of elephant in the room issue that we know this is something that we need to address and think about, but we aren't maybe ready to kind of start to discuss the situation. How do we integrate a country that is in war or is in conflict? And I think that we need to have these discussions even more now.
Sorry. Yes, very true. So it's time to conclude. We were here looking for either separate national perspectives or potential common ground. And I think I detected some differences, but also some common ground. And one common ground that I did see is this idea that there has to be a more of this whole of society approach, both in the candidate countries and within the EU, of actually involving the publics in both countries. And involving also the capitals, not just making it an elite project of the EU bureaucracy. So I think with this, we can conclude that there's hope that we can find common perspectives. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for the speakers, and there's a huge amount of discussion still to be had. I'm happy that we started the discussion with this webinar. Thank you so much.